Hi and welcome back to the third video of the NestJs authentication with JWT and password hashing series. In this video we are very simply covering how to generate the JWT, how to sign it with a secret and with the expiration date, for example. And then we add also Jwt.Guard and with a strategy. So that, for example, if you log in, you will get and return the JWT token, which contains in a payload, for example, your user properties, your name, your email, whatever you need. And then we have another endpoint, which is then protected by a Jwt.Guard, which checks if there's the valid JWT on the request or not. And if it is there, then it will apply the payload to our request and it's all okay. But if you don't give him like a valid JWT token for this service or for our API, then your access is denied or you are unauthorized. So let's have a look at the structure of this video. At first we look at the outcome of this video, then we will read the user story for it, and then we will implement it and close it. So let's have a quick look to the outcome of this video. So you can see here we still have our request where we get all the users and where we want to log in. And before we could access this without a JWT, but now we have a Jwt.Auth Guard in our application for this endpoint here. So we need to give him a valid JWT, otherwise our request will get an error response. So you see we are not authorized to do something or to get the users. So we need a valid JWT attached. And this we can get if we log in with our email and password. Then we get in response the access token, the token type, and the expires in. And then we have to copy and paste our token and say we want to make this request here with bearer token and add this token. And then we can make a simple get request and we get in return all the users, because now we are having a valid JWT that is signed correctly and is not expired. So here we are still in our NestJs Auth JWT series. And the last time we added the register and login routes and hashed the password, and also validated all the requests or the incoming requests if everything is correct. So now we are having story 3, where we want to add the JWT generation with login. So the story is, as a user, I want to be authenticated via a JWT token. So if I make a request against the API, I am authenticated by the JWT token. So here we want that if I hit the login route, and then as before, we use all the stuff where we compare or look up the email, the user, compare the password with the password hash that's stored in the database. And at the moment, we are just sending to our client everything, our login was correct, successful. But now we want to generate a JWT token so that for other requests, we can use this JWT token in the client to validate us against our backend, that I'm actually the user that I am. So we have here some acceptance criteria. So first we want to give an overview over JWT and the implementation in NestJs. So we then go above the documentation here from NestJs and from JWT.io, and we want to install all needed packages. We want to add a function where we generate the JWT to our authentication service. We want to add an import to our JWT, or we want to add the import of our JWT module to our imports array from our Auth.module. So and there we can specify what secret do we want to use and so on. We want to add our Jwt.Guard and our Jwt.Strategy. We will go deeper in this here in the first point where we look over the implementation in NestJs, why we need those guards and strategies. Then we want to generate the JWT in our login function. So right now we're just making a string or returning a string, but actually we want to return then the generated JWT. We want to add a find one function to our user service, because at the moment we are just having the find by email, and this is configured that it also returns the password, but we don't want to add like the password to the user to the user object that we want to return after logging in, or add to our JWT token. And at last, we want to implement our JWT guard on our endpoint where we get all the users. So because on the register endpoint, we don't want a guard because everyone should be able to register. On our login endpoint, we can't have a guard because you first have to log in to have a JWT token, but on our endpoint where we get all the users, we can verify that you can only query this endpoint if you're having a valid JWT token, and only then you will get a response, otherwise you will get an error or an error response. So we can now move this to doing here. And first we want to have a look above or about the JWT token, and then about the implementation in NestJs. So you can always go to the JWT.io page, and here you have an introduction to JSON Web Tokens. So what is a JSON Web Token? It's an open standard that defines a compact and self-contained way for securely transmitting information between parties as a JSON object. So it can be verified and trusted because it is digitally signed, and they can be signed using a secret or a public-private key. And also JWTs can be encrypted, also provide secrecy between parties. We will focus on signed tokens, so they can verify the integrity of the claims contained within it, while encrypted tokens hide most claims from other parties. So when we are using this, the signature also certifies that only the party holding the private key is the one that signed it. So when should we use JSON Web Tokens? So like we do for authorization, this is the most common scenario of using JWT. Once the user is logged in, so we log in, then every request that we make afterwards will be with the JWT. So this will allow us or the user to access route services and so on with that token. We could also make some information exchange where we can transmit information between parties, and we can actually sign, like you can see it here. A JSON Web Token always has 3 parts: a header, a payload, and a signature, and it looks something like this here. We can have a look later on it. So you can see it here. This is an example from JWT.io. So these are the 3 parts: the red, the purple, and the blue one. And you see this, the header, the payload, and the signature. And so this here is the header, and this goes to decode it, which algorithm is used, on what is the type of the token. Then we have the purple thing. This is like the payload. So this can be used, for example, to store some data in it. So we can later, if we generate our own JWT token, we can add here some user properties like ID, name, email, whatever we want to do. Then we have the verifying signature here. You could type in here secret, whatever you want. So you can see here the header consists of 2 parts: type of token and algorithm. The payload are the claims, and where we can add additional data. So we can skip this here a bit. And we have at last the signature. We can take the encoded header, the encoded payload as secret, and sign that. For example, if you want to use the AMAC SHA-256 algorithm, we can do it like this here, and then we have our secret. And this is there to verify that the message wasn't changed along the way. In the case of token signed with a private key, it can also verify that the sender of the JWT is who it says it is. So you can see this would be like an example. Here, and so now we want to implement this into NestJs, and for this we can go over to the authentication part of the documentation of NestJs. So we need this nearly in every application, and Passport is one of the most popular Node.js authentication libraries, and we can implement this by using the NestJs Passport module. So we can already install it. So we can go here in our code, and before we do this, we have to go to our new branch. So we say git-flow feature start, and then we can name it exactly like our story. And then we are on a new branch feature, not a valid name here without the dots. And now we have a new branch, feature NestJs Auth JwT3 based on develop. And so now we can make all our changes. So we can, for example, npm install add NestJs /passport and save it to our package.json. So we can, with passport, we can authenticate a user by verifying the credentials with username, password, JSON web token, whatever we want. We can manage the state by issuing JWT, for example, attach information about to the request object to do something with it later. Yeah, let's go a little bit here. So we need NestJs passport. We need passport itself, I think. Yeah. And you can see here, once we are authenticated, the server will issue JWT that can be sent as a Bearer token in an authorization header on all following requests where we want to prove our authentication. And here you can see for any passport strategy you choose, you will always need the NestJs passport and passport packages. Then you will need to install the strategy specific package, either passport JWT or passport local. And I want to use the passport JWT package. So we can say npm install passport JWT -- save. And then we can implement the strategies. For example, we are having already our Auth.module, our Auth.service. And yeah, we can go over this here. Yeah, we can just skip this here and skip this also. So we could, for example, use here some guards later. Let's go to it here. So you can see here, we can pass, for example, a strategy directly to our Auth Guard, and we don't want to use a local Auth Guard, but I think it's the Jwt.Auth Guard. So we can verify. So you can see here, first we have to import the JWT module into our authentication module, where we give him the secret and when the JWT should expire. So you can see it here, for example. You can sign it, for example, with the time when the token was issued and when it should expire, for example, 10,000 seconds. And then inside this module, we can use the JWT services. So for example, here we have then the Jwt.Auth Guard, which uses the Auth Guard from NestJs passport, which will check if there's a valid JWT or if there's a JWT applied to this request. And if not, then it says no, there's an error. You cannot access this resource. And the other thing that we want to do is we need the JWT strategy. And this is, for example, here, where we will extract from the request the JWT from the auth header as a Bearer token. We are ignoring, or we are not ignoring, the expiration, and we validate this against our secret. And then we can, with the validate, this is like the basic function, this will add to the request if it was valid. It will add the payload, for example, whatever you want to have, like for example the user. So we can then work in our backend with the user ID from, or that is specified in the JWT token. So you can see it here with Jwt.Strategy. We have the JWT from the request here, where we extract the JWT from the request. We have ignore expiration. We choose false because if the JWT is expired, the request will be denied and for 1 will be sent. And we are using the secret or key to supply our secret for signing the token. And this should never be exposed publicly at the moment. Yeah, we will add this later to our Docker Compose file, but in a production environment, this should not be there. Yeah, then we have this validate function here. And this firstly says here that we are having like a valid token that is not there's nothing done to it. So you can see here, as soon as I change something in the token, if I add something, if I remove something, this token becomes invalid. So this verifies that this token is correct. And then the validate function will be adding to the request object a property that we can work with in our backend. So enough with this. Now let's start implementing all this here. So we also need to npm install the nest.js JwT package. And so now we have some, we can check the first step where we make an overview over JwT and implementation in NestJs. We have installed, I think, all the needed packages. If we miss some, we will just import them or install them. Now we want to add a function where we generate the JwT to our authentication service. So we go to our Auth.service here, and we go into our constructor. And here we simply add our JwT service. And this is coming, I think, JwT service. You can see it here from our NestJs JwT package. And with this, we want to generate a JwT. And we also want to return here an observable. And we are just returning a string as an observable from type string, because the JwT is just a large string. And as an input, we take the user from type user interface. And here we return from this JwT service. So we make this an observable. We sign it async, and we have to sign it with an object. And this should be the user. So this will be the payload. And the other stuff that is needed to sign, we will provide here in our authentication module. So we have to make our imports array. And there we need our JwT module. We can register this also async, because we need here to work with the secret. So we have to give it to him. So we need to add an import here. This is our config module. And we need to inject our config service from NestJs so that we can work with the environment variables. And then we can use a simple factory to use our config service. And of course, we should zoom in to use our config service and make a simple function. And here we can say we want to have it with a secret, and the secret we will get from our config service.get, and then we get the JwT secret. And the second thing is we want to sign it with some options. So we say it expires in. And this is, for example, 10,000 seconds. So we can just go over the nest.js config service a bit. So with this, we are able to grab from the environment variables the config or that value that we need. So to get this, we have to provide it, and we can do this very simply in our Docker Compose file, where we have here our API, our nest.js part. And here we can just simply add our JWT secret, and we could, for example, name it normally you should add something that is very hard to guess, like a combination, whatever you want. We can just do it like this here. And normally you should not publish this in a video or anything after all. So now we will get this JWT secret. We will sign, so these are the two parts that we also need to sign it here. So this will sign with the payload user, with the secret, with sign options and so on. So this should work now. Then we have here imported our Jwt module. And in our authentication service, here, I think this should be all. So now we can go to the next part of our story. So we have our JWT, our generateJwt function. Then we have imported the Jwt module to our authentication module. And now we want to add our Jwt.Guard and the strategy. So then it will be clearer why we need those. So in our Auth module, we can generate a new folder for strategies. And we can make a new folder for guards. And then we have here our JWT Auth.Guard.ts. And in our strategy, we want to have our Jwt.Strategy.ts. And then we can start very simple with our guard. And this is nearly a copy and paste what we are doing from the documentation. So this here is our Auth Guard. So this will just verify this. So where we extend the Auth Guard, and we can use this later to check that the request contains a JWT. And then we have our strategy, and the strategy we can also copy and paste a little bit. So of course then we have here our JWT strategy, where we are using passport strategy to extract the token from or the JWT token from the request, and then add here some payload or use the payload that we got to add this to the request. So we can see this later. So here we can say, for example, this here is the payload. We can just add this to payload.user because we are assigning this with the user object in our service. We're assigning this with the user object, and we can get the user from the payload and add this here to our request. I can show you later what this will do. And then we have here our JWT strategy. This will extract, will not ignore the expiration, and then we need our secret. And yeah, this is obviously in our environment variable, so we need here also the config service. We import it. And then we can just call config service nest.get, and then this is our JwT secret. And so it will only call this validate if this here everything is correct. So if there is a JwT, if we are ignoring if the expiration is, or if it's not expired, and if it's signed with the correct secret. Here, so I think we can go to the next part of the story. So we have added our guards, and then we want to generate the JwT in our login function. And here, of course, we now need to add them as providers also. So we say our Auth.service is a provider, then we have our Jwt.Strategy as a provider, and our Jwt.Auth Guard as a provider. And then we can go into our user module, and we can see that in our user controller we have our login route. Then we are going to our user service login. At the moment, if we check if we use or we search for the user by email, then we check if the password is valid, if there's a user. If it doesn't find a user, this is undefined, and then we will throw an HTTP exception. But if we find a user with this email, then we check if the password from the user is correct against the password hash in the database. And so if it matches, then we say login was successful. If not, we throw an exception. So this is something here we want to create the JwT and sign it and add as payload our user object from the database. So what we want to do here is we cannot use this user here because this is coming from the find user by email, and here we are also providing the password property, and we don't want to return this in the token. Even if it's a hash, we don't want to return this to the front end or to the client. So first we need a new function here where we just find one by ID. So we can simply call it find one. We get an ID which is from type number, and we are returning an observable from type user interface. And this simply returns from our user repository .find1, and we specify the ID. And then we can use it here. We can very simply just say this.find1 user.id. And then we pipe the outcome, so the user that we get, and we make a switch map to end the call, and there we get in return a user. And with this user, we want now generate a JwT, so we can call our Auth.service and generate our JwT. And as a payload, we want to have our user. Now we have to see what is wrong here. So you see we have to cancel this here, I think. Make a switch map from it. So then we have, because we don't want to return here also the observable, but we want to cancel this, work with this, and then return define one and return then the JwT token that is created. And now we can do something with this in the controller. So this should now return us here the JwT token. And to make it a little bit nicer looking, we can pipe this token, and we get this as an observable string. So we are getting the JwT as a string. And then we can do something with it. And we want to return an object to our client. And this could be, for example, with the access token. And here we provided the JwT. Then we have our token type that we can say, which is from JwT. And we can say this is expires in, and we say this is like 10,000 seconds, so that we have some information in our client. So then we can go over here and check. So we generate now the JwT in our login function. We have added defined one to our service so that the password property is not being returned. And then we want to implement the Jwt.Guard on our endpoint, so getting all the users. And to simply do this, we can use the use guards from nest.js. And then we can very simply say we want to use our Jwt.Auth Guard, which will check if there's a valid JwT attached to our request. If it is, then it will also go with a strategy and add the user, so our payload, to our request object. And we can make this so that we see it. So we could, for example, I think it's the request object from, so if we are going with the express, then we have here our request, and we could, for example, log it out, and then this should be our user. So then we should see this in the terminal here. And yeah, if we are not giving him a JwT, then it should give us a 401 error. Here, so now we can check. We have done this also. And then we can at last add another point where we check with postman. So now we can build everything and say docker compose build. We can already go here. So we see we have here our 3 endpoints. So the first one is to register or make a post request for making a new user to get all users. And this should now be restricted because we are not having a JwT provided. Then we should not get, or we just should get an HTTP error. And if we try to log in, then it should answer with a valid JwT. And then we can take this JwT and this to this request here, and then we should also get all the users in return. So we have built it, and then we can start it. And now we can check against all the endpoints. We see we have here our endpoints. So we now can try to request all users. This should not work because we are not having a JwT. And so you see we are getting 401 unauthorized. And we're not even going into it. So then the second thing that we can do is we can log in. And so if we log in, for example, with the wrong email, we get user not found 404. This is correct. If we have the right email but the wrong password, we get also login was not successful. But if we have the right email and the right password, then we get as response our access token, our token type, and the expires in. And we could now copy and paste this token from here and add this to here. And then you can see the decoded token is here the user object in our payload with the ID 3, the name, and my email. And we have the issued at, so it was signed at now, and it will expire in 10,000 seconds, so in 1.5 hours or something like this. Here, so this should work, and now we could add this JwT as a bearer token to our get request here. So we can go into authorization in Postman very easily. We add, say we want to authenticate with a BIRA token, and copy and paste the BIRA token to here, and then make a simple GET request to our users. Then you see we are getting returned a 200 OK status and getting returned all the users that are in the database. And you can already see here, if we use guards, first we use our Jwt.Auth Guards, and we use the Jwt.Strategy to check if it is not expired, if the secret is correct. So we get the secret from our environment variables, so from the Docker Compose, and we extract the Jwt from the auth header, and if it is valid, then we add to this request the user. So from outside of our Jwt, we then get this user object here and add it to the request so that we can then, for example, work inside our service with it. So we can now remove this because we don't need this comment here. Here, I think this should be all for this video. So we can now go to the story. We say we checked everything with Postman. We can save this. Then we can commit all the changes and close the story. So now we can stop the server or the Docker containers. And we can say git add upper A and make a commit message. And this starting thing should be again the name of our story. And then we say implement Jwt generation and add basic Jwt.Guard to get users endpoint. And then we can say we want to merge this back into our develop branch. So we say git-flow feature finish. Now we have it back on our develop branch. We switched also to the develop branch and deleted the old branch.